In Frostpunk 2, I was responsible for a growing population of desperate people, trying to forge a new life in a world that had frozen over. One of the city's factions pleaded that I, the steward, repeal a law that would require citizens to rotate relationships in order to increase childbirth, and instead enact a law that forced mandatory marriage. By my personal morals, neither law was the right one, but I was at the mercy of my people, the communities they had built, and the radical factions that had formed from extreme ideologies. This is what they wanted. Still, my doubt outweighed their request and I denied. In return, that faction conducted a protest that would erupt into a civil war. Chaos ran rampant, tension rose, and the trust I had forged with my people diminished. I knew this would happen. After all, it's the fragile society I built, whether I liked it or not. After 30 hours in Frostpunk 2, to me it was just another day as a steward attempting to mitigate the downfall of a civilization hanging on a thread wearing thin. Frostpunk 2 is a compelling, while cynical, view of survival, and a challenging strategy game that sets itself apart from its contemporaries in the city building genre. Did I feel good watching a city I had developed over the course of 9 in-game years start to come apart at the seams, despite having a stockpile of resources to survive for years to come? Nope. But Frostpunk 2 taught me that I'm not supposed to feel good about it. Instead, it conditioned me to accept that no matter my best laid plans, unifying a society with a shared vision of the future was a fool's errand. Surviving Mother Nature's greatest woes is one thing, but surviving human nature is the true adversary. This means that while you build a city, you're also building the values of society's future, creating two distressing challenges to juggle at once. Taking place 30 years after the events of its predecessor, Frostpunk 2 starts with the captain dead, and the city needing to grow and go on without him. You play as a steward, less a leader like the first game's captain, and more a mediator for the needs of the city and its people. No longer can you simply just pass a law to replace food with sawdust. As a steward, passing that law means taking it to a council made up of the city's communities where its enactment is determined by a vote. Being made an agent between parties rather than a ruler is what makes Frostpunk 2 a significantly different experience from the first, and in doing so, makes it an excellent entry point for new players. While both games share the same values of building a city and navigating human nature by way of forming laws and societal views, Frostpunk 2 carries over very little in moment-to-moment gameplay from the first, making much of the city building, law passing, and technological research feel completely new. It's the change in power dynamic that cements Frostpunk 2's themes best. It makes it more a meditation in accepting that you cannot and will not please everyone.
Hear ye, the votes are in, the measure fails.
This is a theme that existed in the first, but the depth of its exploration pales in comparison to how its successor puts it at the forefront. Now, trudging through morally despicable areas is familiar territory for returning Frostpunk players, whether that's instilling child labor or allowing public executions. But Frostpunk 2 makes these choices less black and white, and expands them into grayer tones by way of complex and layered social systems. In Frostpunk 2, you keep track of how your city is faring through trust and tension, as opposed to the first game's hope and discontent. Thing is, the basic necessities of a human's existence, whether it's shelter, food, or heat, are only a small facet of the myriad of other factors that determine your success as a steward in Frostpunk 2. This time, you must uphold relations with the city's communities, too. Several communities can form in your city, each with their own set of morals, beliefs, and ideologies. While some communities will have overlapping values, each one still has a distinct view of what is best for the city. The addition of communities paint a clear image of how this world has developed since the first, which gives weight to the world and its ongoing progression. If you choose to build your city on the values of one community more than the other, then members of that community may split off to form a radicalized faction based on those beliefs. becoming an extremist borough all its own. The game features several communities, with each playthrough orienting around 3 at any given time. In addition, there are numerous factions that can form within each community, many of which I'm still discovering. All of them have their own influence on the choices you make to develop your city, so the level of complexity is high and the balance tricky to strike. Balancing the needs and beliefs of a faction is like tending a flickering flame so you don't set your house ablaze, or, in this case, your city. As previously mentioned, if a faction's views are rejected enough, they'll protest, and that will raise tension. But, on the other hand, if they're favored too much, a devout cult-like following will begin to form, halting even your ability to mitigate the city's next development. As a player, I had no tolerance in supporting a radicalized group that teetered on fascist totalitarian beliefs. But despite rejecting its proposed laws or demands, I was faced with knowing they lived among my city and sat in my console's chairs. It created a rigid scenario for me to navigate, and knowing outwardly I couldn't simply banish them, I was forced to strategically play the long game in building up my own forces and prisons for when the inevitable protests began. This balance and power struggle made for exhilarating and stressful planning that got under my skin. Even when I wasn't playing Frostpunk 2, I would be scheming on how to tackle the next challenge or planning 5 steps ahead while going about my daily routine. Communities and factions are the backbone of the game's densely interwoven systems, where every decision you make, from the buildings you erect to the laws you pass and the ideas you research, weaves a web of permutations and possibilities. Each choice you make sets off a chain reaction that paves the way to new laws, ideas, and opportunities, as well as conflicts. Support a community that values economy and tradition, and new ideas to support those agendas emerge. However, equally, you close the door on potentially developing technology to better withstand the next harsh storm. Understanding how it all interlocks together is a steep learning curve that took me the entirety of the game's 15-hour story. But once understood, the game's impressive overlapping system of consequences is fully revealed and opens up a tremendous amount of opportunity for experimentation that kept me coming back for more. That overlapping system of consequences translates into a chain of events and cause and effect that shows even in its city building. Building something as necessary as a research center to develop your city's ideas requires a series of actions, including breaking the ice to create a suitable foundation, building a housing district, and then expanding that district to enable a building slot in which you can place a research center. Each action requires workforce and resources to fulfill. Like building a hospital, for example, requires the idea to be researched, which can be done by any one community, which in turn supports their ideologies, and that also requires the housing district to be expanded again before actually building the hospital. And this is only just a small glimpse at the many variables of interconnected hurdles to manage and think ahead about. Similarly, the staggering amount of laws to explore and the process in passing them requires careful consideration. Taking a law to council will see you navigating each community and faction, the process for which can vary based on the variables of your playthrough. Even with dozens of hours in game, I've yet to explore or see them all. Each law has its own effect, whether it's requiring the sick to quarantine, which increases shelter demand, or making the sick wear a badge that identifies them as infectious, which raises tension. Both laws support a different community's values, and enacting the one you think is best requires negotiating with undecided parties. Negotiating in of itself carries its own burden, as it requires making a promise to an undecided community. These promises can come by way of proposing a law they want, or even repealing one that currently exists. Or maybe it simply means paying them off. There's a lot going on in this game, and it involves navigating a lot, and I mean a lot, of menus, as well as blocks of text to digest all of its rules and systems. It took me hours to confidently maneuver through the many menus within menus, which are, well, a necessity to the game's layered design. It's hard to view it as a criticism, as I think its menu navigation is a best-case scenario, all things considered, but I can see it being a barrier of entry for some players, even returning ones. Now, at least to Frostpunk 2's credit, it does a good job of including text boxes and expandable tutorials over nearly every significant prompt and decision. Now, it can be easy to be caught up in the minutiae of navigating politics and making sure your city has all it needs to thrive. Between all the law passing and stressful decision making, expanding a metropolis is a rewarding achievement made tangible through a visual feast. There's a lot of personality in Frostpunk 2 that seem missing in the dour and gray attitude of the first one. That extra layer of personality is emphasized by being able to zoom into a district where you can occasionally maybe spot some of your workers making snow angels. Isn't that nice? Details like this add the smallest glimpse of needed levity to a world that is otherwise, extremely depressing. Exploring the Frostland, the frozen land beyond your city limits, has also received some upgrades from the first, as now finding resources requires building connecting trailways back to your city. It also adds opportunities to set up additional colonies, which could act like miniature versions of your city from which you can transport goods, just in case managing one city wasn't difficult enough. It's imperative to explore the Frostland to thrive and survive, but unlocking more areas of the overmap can get bogged down by a camera that just doesn't zoom out enough to get the full lay of the land. Navigating the Frostland and keeping track of outposts and planning ahead for future expeditions was accompanied by what felt like unnecessary stress due in part to its camera, making an already dense and convoluted game harder to manage. After the credits rolled, I realized that there was still so much I hadn't quite understood, and that's only a side effect to the nature of the game's intricate design. It's in Utopia mode, the game's endless mode, where its replayability and experimentation takes full form. It's here where you can try your hand at developing a city in different scenarios of varying sizes and resources, whether that's to expand out into the Frostland or create a heavily populated metropolis. Frostpunk 2 doesn't replace the first game. Instead, it elevates its raw themes of human nature to towering heights. It offers a significantly different challenge in its city building that allows both games to exist in separate sectors of the genre, and it's better for it. Developer 11-Bit Studios continues to follow a theme with each consecutive game, starting with its breakout success, This War of Mine. With Frostpunk 2, 11-Bit Studios has built its systems and mechanics around asking you to make inconceivably difficult choices, most of which only lead to the best case scenario, not the right one. Frostpunk 2 is a great step forward in both the studio's evolution and the survival city building genre it helped pioneer.